Hi, I'm Kris Somerville, and I'm here with the Missouri Review's editor, Speer. And recently, we were talking about some of our content and realized that we have a surprising number of favorite stories in common. One of our favorites, and I know it's a story that we both teach in our writing workshops with great success, is Susan Perabo's story, Explaining Death to the Dog.
It's a perfect example of knowing where to start and where to end the story.
It's also an example of a story that's written about an impossible subject, a young couple who has just lost their first child.
As a technique, she chooses to focus on the behavior of the family dog who had a hand in raising the child. Stu is a sensitive dog. He's perplexed by the baby's absence.
It's a story that's really both amazing in terms of its use of humor and its command of the material, but also there's a wonderful distance towards this subject. And that distance comes from the obvious fact that the young mother is grieving from her loss.
I love the way her husband is trying to take control of the situation, to do the right things and to have the right attitude. But the wife wants to understand the mystery of the death. She focuses very much on the behavior of the dog, which is a perfect example of sublimation, where one takes an impossible situation and tries to find a way to talk about it.
She realizes right through watching the dog that death is quiet and that both the dog and themselves will never understand death. All that they're really going to understand by the end of the story is that the baby is gone and the baby is not coming back.
It really does deal successfully with a difficult subject.
I know we both also admire Jonathan Veit's story, Homage. I remember when you found that story in the slush pile, you read it, and then you went wild running around the office trying to find someone to read that story. And, you know, we all agreed it's a great story.
This is also about a young couple, William and Rachel, and their neighbor Mincy. The young couple have been trying for some time to have a baby. Meanwhile, they have a more immediate issue. Their neighbor has begun to act angry towards them.
Yeah, he suddenly starts acting very strange, and it's rather mysterious because Mincy has always been rather friendly. But this year, he doesn't want William to cut his grass or to share the hay.
We get lots of nice character details about both Rachel and William, who are reasonable people who love each other. We also get a sense of their daily ritual on the farm.
And then there's this increasing curiosity about what's going on with this neighbor because he just begins to act incredibly strange, cutting down trees and the like.
Eventually, he begins to go so far as to tear down his house. At the same time, Rachel has her third or fourth miscarriage. She's drawn to Mincy's house one evening without telling William, and together the two of them finish destroying his home and actually light it on fire. William comes out to see the fire and to see both Mincy and his wife coming down the hill. And the story ends with tears coming down her cheeks and her arms wide open and the flames behind them. It ends with the statement, "The flames don't touch them, they do not dare."
As an editor, aren't you supposed to object to this use of pathetic fallacy? For example, describing feelings to fire?
But it is in fact a successful, powerful moment that dramatizes the fact that sometimes we may need to undertake what on the surface seems like a destructive act as a way to expel demons.
Another one of my favorite stories is Nancy Kincaid's Why Richard Can't. Now that was one of my finds. Nancy was hardly a new discovery because I know that we had published her before. But again, it's such a terrific story. It's a real ironic romance.
It's a story told through the center of consciousness of Richard, who is an English professor at a small college. He falls in love with a student, an older student, with two teenage girls, and they have a passionate love affair. We're in Richard's mind, viewing the circumstances as he tries to come to terms with all the hesitations within himself for the romance, which he feels quite deeply is unreasonable.
You're right. And what's interesting is the conflict in the story is mostly internal, and yet it has such narrative drive and great forward movement, and there's real command of this story.
The reader knows that he or she is going somewhere, and there is promise of revelation. It's a story that has genuine romance, but is ultimately about the character's inertia.
Robert Olin Butler's Titanic, Victim Speaks Through Waterbed is also really another delightful piece of fiction.
It's a concept story from a collection called Tabloid Dreams. The concept behind the collection is that Butler has chosen in advance to write fiction, good stories based on tabloid titles, mostly ridiculous titles, of course.
In this story, as you mentioned, it's a high concept story. We have a narrator who's dead, and he's floating around from one state of being to another. He has this vague idea of where he's going in this journey from one stage to another, but only the reader really knows that he's trapped inside a waterbed.
What it's really about is the night of his death when the Titanic sank. It's a story, in fact, about a moment in one's life and how a moment can be definitive. How even in a brief spark of time, something important can happen. In this case, falling in love.
He is a British man who's stationed in India, and now he's traveling about a bit.
The story begins after the ship has already been struck, after it's already beginning to settle in the water. He's pure British, saying things like, I must say that a body is useful for formal occasions as well. All this floating about seems much too casual to me.
Such a wonderful British accent you have, Speer. Despite the fact that it's really, again, a high concept story, it's quite sad and really compelling.
We also have to mention William Gay's Those Deep Elms Brown Fairy Blues.
Yeah, William is a wonderful writer from Tennessee, and this was his first publication.
It's a realistic story about an older man named Scribner who has Alzheimer's and is being cared for by his son Raven, who is a school teacher in the country in Alabama. The story is from the old man's point of view.
Scribner both appreciates the fact that his son is taking care of him, but then in that old way acts rather dismissive towards both his son and his son's occupation.
And as it develops, a mystery arises in which Scribner begins to remember things that happened in the past when both his son and daughter were very young adults. He keeps trying to remember a certain night when a very dramatic thing happened.
Yes, his son keeps denying that anything that he remembers even happened. He also, the author, gives the story a lot of comic moments. For example, when the old man tries to put the make on his nurse. It's quite funny.
Mm-hmm. There are many wonderful things about the story, including the fact that the voice partakes of the place where it's set, where there's surprising eloquence in this backcountry American way. In fact, the voice and eloquence in the story are partly why it's anything but depressing, despite the fact that it's finally tragic. To create a genuinely tragic mood in a short story is very difficult because the short form usually doesn't allow you to create the grandness necessary for tragedy.
Wouldn't you say that there's probably not one single thing to be learned from the success of these short stories other than the fact that they all succeed in their own right, and that best stories often violate standard rules that you teach in workshop or you might have learned?
They may be highly conceptual, they may commit what are normally thought to be errors, pathetic fallacy and homage, They may be strikingly simple, or they may deal with an altogether impossible subject, like the death of a baby, and yet succeed.